4,000 years ago, Sodom was the most desirable city in the ancient world. Fertile land, flourishing trade, a skyline of walls, gates, and civic order built over generations by people who believed they had figured out how a civilization should work. Then, one morning, Abraham looked toward the valley where all of it stood and saw smoke rising like the smoke of a furnace. The city wasn't destroyed because it was poor, forgotten, or weak. It was destroyed at the absolute height of its power. And what the Bible says actually caused it is not what most people think, and it is far closer to the present than anyone is comfortable admitting. Before the destruction, this region looked nothing like the wasteland it became. Genesis 13 describes the Jordan Valley as well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, green, fertile, and thriving. 5 cities flourished across this plain: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. Archaeologists call it a pentopolis, a 5-city network connected by trade routes that moved goods across Canaan, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. When Abraham gave his nephew Lot first choice of land, Lot looked at this valley and chose it without hesitation. That tells you everything. This was prime real estate in the ancient world. Lot wasn't moving toward poverty, he was moving toward the most desirable address in the region, and Sodom was its crown, which makes what came next even harder to explain. Here is where most people get this story wrong. Ask anyone what destroyed Sodom, and they'll name one sin. But the prophet Ezekiel, writing centuries after destruction, gives a different diagnosis. In Ezekiel 16:49, God says, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." Pride, excess, comfort, deliberate indifference. The city hadn't just failed in one specific way, it had become structurally indifferent to human suffering while sitting on top of extraordinary abundance. Pride, excess of food, prosperous ease, indifference to the suffering happening right outside the gate. Tell me those words don't describe a world you recognize. That is what makes this story so difficult to read and so impossible to dismiss as ancient history. What did daily life actually look like? Sodom had a gate. Genesis 19:1 places Lot sitting at the gate when the angels arrived. In the ancient Near East, the city gate was the center of civic life, where elders deliberated, merchants negotiated contracts, and disputes were settled. This means Sodom had formal governance, civic structure, social hierarchy. Archaeologists working at Tal el-Hammam in Jordan, currently the leading candidate for the biblical Sodom, have uncovered evidence of a large, sophisticated Bronze Age city, massive defensive walls, complex pottery, grain storage, and trade goods from distant regions. This was not a settlement of wandering nomads, it was a city with infrastructure, commerce, and regional influence. And yet, the night 2 strangers walked through its gates, everything that city had built was about to be used against it. When 2 strangers arrived at the gate in evening, Lot recognized them as travelers needing shelter and urged them inside. In the ancient Near East, hospitality to strangers was not optional. It was one of the most sacred social obligations a person could honor. To turn away a traveler was a moral failure of the highest order. What happened next reveals exactly how far the city had gone. The men of the city surrounded Lot's house, not a fringe element. Genesis 19:4 says all the men from every part of the city. This was not a group acting against the city's values. This was the city's values made visible. The strangers, who were in fact angels, struck the crowd with blindness, and even blinded, the men of the city kept searching for the door. That detail is worth sitting with. Lot was told to leave before dawn. He told his sons-in-law. They thought he was joking. Quietly, that is the most devastating detail in the entire account. These were men who had lived inside this city long enough that the idea of divine judgment felt not terrifying but absurd. Lot, his wife, and 2 daughters were led out by hand. The text says the angels had to physically pull them while the city still slept. Then, in the words of Genesis 19:24, the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities. Abraham rose early the next morning and looked toward the valley. Genesis 19:28 says smoke was rising, like the smoke of a furnace. The cities of the plain were gone. In 2021, a peer-reviewed study published in Scientific Reports documented findings at Tal el-Hammam, the leading archaeological candidate for Sodom. That stopped researchers mid-analysis. The evidence pointed to a cosmic airburst event, temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius generated in seconds. Pottery at the site had melted and refused. Mud bricks had vitrified, partially turned to glass from extreme heat. Researchers documented shocked quartz grains, a platinum spike in the sediment, and skeletal remains of people caught in the middle of ordinary activity. One destruction layer, the entire settlement erased. The land was left uninhabitable for centuries afterwards. The Bible says the smoke rose like a furnace. The archaeology says the ground itself melted. Here is what almost no one discusses. When Abraham pleaded with God before the destruction, God agreed to spare the entire city if even 10 righteous people could be found. 10 people. Not a majority, not a reformation. 10 people. God wasn't requiring perfection. He was searching for a remnant, any thread of something that could still be saved. The search came back empty. But the fact that God delayed, entered into a negotiation and sent angels to confirm before acting, that detail rewrites the entire character of this story. The destruction of Sodom was not impulsive. It was the last step of a God who had been patient for a very long time. Thousands of years later, Jesus referenced Sodom, not as ancient history, but as a mirror for his own generation. In Luke chapter 17, verse 28, he described the days of Lot, people eating, drinking, buying, selling, planting, building, right up until the moment fire fell from the sky. Not people who saw the warning and ignored it, but people who never saw it coming because prosperity had convinced them that nothing in their world needed to change. That is the part of this story that never became ancient.